Penny's Big Breakaway is a retro modern-day 3D platformer that in 2024 was able to provide a creative and unique platforming experience, which is great, but that alone doesn't make a game worth playing. So let me explain why you should really think about playing Penny's Big Breakaway. The story in Penny's Big Breakaway, like nearly every platformer I played, is very silly, and as we all know, platformers aren't played for the story. But the game's story starts out with Penny reading a flyer advertising that there's an open audition for performers to enter into a yo-yo contest to become the Emperor's full-time yo-yo performer. During Penny's audition, her yo-yo decides to become sentient and it attacks the Emperor. The Emperor blames Penny and deems her a felon for the attack and sentences her to 10,000 years in prison. Penny escapes the palace before she can be thrown in prison, but is pursued the entire game by the Emperor's army of penguins. Now we must set out on a journey across space and time to prove Penny's innocence. Penny's Big Breakaway is a 3D platformer that feels like it was ripped directly from the late 90s or early 2000s, which in many ways can be a good thing because some of the most memorable 3D platformers came out during that era, but there was also a number of elements that held that era of platformers back from being truly great. And interestingly enough, some of those issues are still present here in 2024, but to what extent I'll get into. The gameplay elements I'm talking about that plagued many platformers back then was the camera angles and not being able to make a jump and determine the distance to land on the platform you were trying to reach. And if it's hard to determine how far you're supposed to jump, it can at times make games frustrating depending on how much patience you have. I do think Penny's has some areas like this that can be frustrating, and obviously that amount of frustration is going to vary based on each player's skill set and level of patience. For me, it wasn't a huge deal and surely not enough to take away from my overall enjoyment, but I have read some user reviews on Steam that suggest much of the experience was frustrating, so I want to be clear that the level of frustration I experienced was extremely minor and not enough to offset everything else the game had going on for it. With that said, let me tell you now about the gameplay. In Penny's Big Breakaway, all of your moves outside of the jump button revolve around the yo-yo. And it's fun because you can do a ton of different tricks with your yo-yo and you get to learn new abilities as you progress through the game's story. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, yo-yos were really cool. I had a few yo-yos growing up, but I really sucked at it, so Penny's Big Breakaway was an opportunity for me to be good with the yo-yo since I'm terrible in real life, so that was fun. Outside of attacking with the yo-yo, you can also ride the yo-yo at any time in the game, and sometimes you have to ride the yo-yo in order to reach certain platforms. It's pretty fun to ride the yo-yo, but sometimes it can be really tough to control Penny, so you've got to be strategic on when you ride the yo-yo. All the moves and yo-yo button combos were fairly simple to learn, and if you forgot any of them, you can just go into the pause menu and double check the controls. Each level has 3 NPC quests scattered throughout each level that are fun and force you to take the less obvious path. Completing these quests will net you more points and a larger audience when you perform your stunt at the end of each level, which is a little bonus minigame that's pretty fun. When it comes to enemy variety, every enemy you encounter in the game is the same enemy from Billy Madison. Yes, you heard that right. The main enemy is a penguin and they come at you in droves the entire game. But it is actually really fun. The penguins attack you by jumping onto your back, and if you allow 5 penguins to jump on your back without you shaking them off with your yo-yo moves, then you die and you have to restart from your last checkpoint. Each level has an ascending timer, so you don't have to finish the levels in a certain amount of time, but there are bonus points awarded if you finish the level quickly. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to try and speedrun my way through each level, or if I should try to collect as many coins and collectibles as possible. I decided to go with the latter and explore the levels and leave the speedrunning to after I beat the game. The currency and collectibles are optional, but if you want to purchase and play all of the extra levels, you're going to want to make sure you acquire all the collectibles. And I'll have more on that in the replay value section of the review. Something I really appreciated is that each level is full of surprises and fun ways to platform and explore each level. Just to name a few, you'll find breakable walls, warp pipes, alternate paths, and zip lines in almost every level. And who doesn't love zip lining in a video game, right? I feel like the developers sat down and talked about the elements they love most in a platformer and tried to fit all of that into Penny's Big Breakaway. And for the most part, I think it really worked. After the first few levels, the game gave me vibes of Sonic Adventure, Super Mario 3D World, and Astro's Playroom, which is obviously great company to be in, but at the same time, the game still felt like a wholly unique platforming experience. And this makes sense because the team is made up of former Sonic Mania developers. Now, before we get to the next category, I want to briefly mention that the boss fights in the game, they weren't too tough, but they were pretty fun and clever. The boss fight from World 3 is especially cool, and if you end up playing this game and remember, leave a comment and let me know what you thought about that boss fight. When it comes to the game's graphics and performance, Penny's Big Breakaway is locked in at a solid 60 frames per second on the PS5, and I hear it also runs at 60 FPS on Switch, but only in docked mode, and that it runs at 30 FPS in handheld mode, so keep that in mind if you're debating which console to buy it for. As you can see in my gameplay footage, the art style is extremely colorful and lively, and if you look close enough, it definitely has some Sonic vibes to it, which I've always enjoyed the Sonic games, so I appreciated that. Diving in now to the music, which is a real highlight. I thought the soundtrack was superb from beginning to end. It sounds modern day retro in the best way possible. It's funny, as I was playing the game, I decided to look up who was credited for the game's soundtrack because I was enjoying it so much. And when I saw it was T. Lopes, it all made sense because this entire scenario has happened a handful of times where I'm playing a game, I'm loving the soundtrack, and then I find out it was T. Lopes. T was responsible for Sonic Mania, Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom, Streets of Rage 4, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, and Sonic Superstars, and he also held the title of Original Game Supervisor for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. So, quite the resume Mr. Lopes has built. So if you enjoyed the music from any of those games, then I think you will love the soundtrack in Penny's Big Breakaway, because it seems like each soundtrack that T. Lopes works on is better than the last one, and the last one is always really good. So, who is this game for? I'd say it's for anyone that is a fan of platformers like Mario and Sonic, and to a degree Astro's Playroom. Anyone who considers themselves a big fan of platformers should at some point play Penny's Big Breakaway. Discussing the game's overall content and replay value, I gotta say I was surprised with the size of the levels. I wasn't expecting them to be as big as they are, and for every level to have alternate branching paths, collectibles, and mini quests, and there's actually a lot of levels in the game. Now, I mentioned earlier that I would talk some more about the game's collectibles and how that plays into the overall replay value. And it's funny because the collectibles in this game is like almost identical to the game I just reviewed last week, which was Mario vs. Donkey Kong on Switch. Literally no different here. There's 3 collectibles for each level in Penny's Big Breakaway, and you can use said collectibles to purchase new levels that really focus on the platforming aspect. These levels are much shorter than the main levels, but they have no checkpoints and will provide you with the game's most challenging platforming. These levels very much reminded me of 2 games in particular, but oddly enough from the same franchise. They remind me of Super Mario World's Star Road levels, which in my opinion were a lot of fun. And the other game they remind me of is Super Mario Sunshine, and I'm talking about the secret levels from Super Mario Sunshine. In my opinion, the secret levels could have been the whole game, and it probably would have been better received. Not to say I didn't like Mario Sunshine, but I thought the secret levels was the best thing about that game. Now, I can't say that these levels are better than the main levels in Penny's Big Breakaway, but that's only because the main levels are really good too. Anyone who enjoys tough platforming is going to love the bonus levels. After this review, I still got to go back and unlock 4 more bonus levels so I can beat them all, but I will actually do that just because they were so much fun. The difficulty level in Penny's Big Breakaway is pretty moderate. Like any platformer, if you take your time and you don't rush your jumps and you do your best to stay in control, it's not going to be too difficult. And like most modern day games these days, you don't have to worry about running out of lives or seeing a game over screen. When it comes to the game's emotion and charm, I gotta say I was taken back by how well the developers were able to capture that 90s and early 2000s platformer feel. The game felt both brand new and nostalgic at the same time, and I always appreciate when a game can find a way to strike a balance of new and old. A few frustrating platforming sections aside, I found myself smiling throughout the whole game and honestly had a ton of fun. Now, according to HowLongToBeat.com, Penny's Big Breakaway takes around 8 to 10 hours to complete and around 15 hours to obtain all the collectibles to then unlock and complete the bonus levels. To me, this is a really good deal, seeing as how you can pick up the game for only $29.99. With all that said, it's now time to share my final thoughts. Penny's Big Breakaway was an absolute blast from beginning to end. In my experience playing, you can experience frustrating sections in every video game, but it's up to us to decide how we are going to handle those experiences, right? Are we going to let the few things we don't like in a game ruin everything else we do like? I review games in the same manner I live my life, in that I don't sweat the small stuff and I don't hyper focus on the negative things. I am aware of them and I do take account of them, but I don't let the small number of bad things outweigh the great number of good things. After completing Penny's Big Breakaway, the first thought I had is that we need more 3D platformers that try new things in the way that Penny's Big Breakaway did with its yo-yo mechanic. It's fun, it's creative, and it's different. It's nice to play a 3D platformer that ticks all of those boxes and still feels like a fairly high budget experience, especially when so many development teams are not able to take those kinds of creative risks due to the massive budgets and costs involved. I feel like developer Evening Star went out and made exactly the game they wanted to make without anyone from the corporate structure getting in the way or putting a stop to their creativity. In closing, I highly recommend picking up Penny's Big Breakaway and really think you'll find a lot to love here. If you'd like to see more game reviews like this, just click that video right up there. As always, thank you for watching, and remember, never too old to play video games.